The leading thinkers in the non-subscribing tradition in the 19th century all defined themselves, or described themselves as Unitarian, but the denomination was not known and has never been known as Unitarian. And as a matter of fact, in the 19th century, we can't really think about a denomination because there were the three distinct groups: the Synod of Munster, which had never given in to the idea of subscription to confessions and creeds, the Presbytery of Antrim, which commenced in the early 18th century, and of course the Remonstrant Synod. And these three separate strands formed an association to work together and so that they could cooperate, and they sometimes even referred to themselves as a denomination, but there were three independent bodies. And one of the non-subscribers of that time was James Martineau. We usually think of him quite rightly as an English theologian, but as a matter of fact he was ordained in one of the congregations in Dublin and ministered there for a time, and even had a school in Dublin, as a lot of ministers did at that time. And Martineau expressed the idea that Unitarianism should not be thought of as a denomination. It was a style of theology, and there were Unitarians in many different denominations. And by and large, this was the attitude that the non-subscribers took. And so what they did was, instead of calling themselves the Unitarian Church or Unitarians in that sense, Unitarian denomination, was they formed associations, they formed societies, and these Unitarian societies where Unitarian ideas were thought through and discussed. But there was always a distinction between the nature of the denomination as being non-subscribing and the idea that you could espouse a Unitarian theology if you wanted to. Non-subscribers have always been free to follow the theological line of thinking that accords most to their own conscience. And one of these Unitarian societies in the 19th century was for what they called the diffusion of knowledge. And so it oversaw the availability of books and tracts and pamphlets that might express ideas that were suited to the kind of thinking that they had at the time. And David Maginnis, Reverend David Maginnis, was a committee member in this society, and for a time he was book secretary. He was responsible for acquiring the books that people would be looking to and reading, and by which they would be influenced. And one of the people whose books he acquired for dissemination through the society was Theodore Parker. Now, Parker was an American thinker who was very influenced by Channing, and indeed Montgomery and his followers were very influenced by Channing. And so these ideas are all really coming from the same place, and very often it's just a matter of degree as to why or not there was difference between them. And one scholar has even commented on the sinking morass that you're likely to fall into, the bottomless pit, the mire that you're likely to fall into if you try to disentangle these different strands of thinking. But Parker, who incidentally, although he was reviled here, was very highly thought of in America, and who influenced Abraham Lincoln. He continued on with his influence. He influenced Martin Luther King Jr., and he had certain ideas about the equality of women. He was very, very interested in all aspects of social justice, and particularly the equality of women, which meant that even the early feminist movement recognised and acknowledged some of his ideas. So he was a very radical thinker, but his ideas did not accord with the more conservative Unitarians here in Ireland. And Maginnis was increasingly getting into trouble for wanting to bring these new ideas out. And Maginnis's own theology had developed as well. He likens it to a purgatorial experience as he questions his faith. And he eventually reaches a position where he believes Jesus to be a teacher, but he questions the divine nature even of Jesus' mission. So he's going further than Blakely, while Blakely thought Jesus was a human being and possibly the Son of God, but not part of the Godhead in any way, or not divine in nature, he did believe that Jesus was divinely inspired. Maginnis went a little further than that, and most of the non-subscribers rejected his thinking outright. And Montgomery, in order to try to control this new style of thinking that this younger generation was bringing out, decided to advance a new code of discipline. And it took nearly 10 years for this code of discipline to emerge, in part because it was so difficult to produce, in part because Montgomery himself, it has to be said, endured personal tragedy in the death of his son during these years. But the main questions that this new code was concerned with were in relation to the preparation of people coming forward for ministry, to their attitude to scripture, and to their attitude to the nature of Jesus. And Maginnis was branded an infidel because of his ideas, which didn't accord with those of Montgomery. And this tells us something about how fearful the more conservative non-subscribers of the time may have been, because of course in earlier days, at the time of the Remonstrance, they were being accused of being infidels, and so they may have feared that these new ideas being introduced by Maginnis were going too far and playing into the hands of their enemies. Maginnis refused to give answers when he was asked these questions. Although he was already ordained, would he admit these things? And it effectively became, as far as he and his followers were concerned, a requirement to subscribe. And Montgomery was lampooned, accused of behaving in exactly the way that Cook had behaved at the time of the Remonstrance. There were 4 questions originally, although these were tailored and changed and edited before the code eventually came into existence. But one writer even had 7 questions, one of which was, do you reject the doctrines of Calvinism? And the next was effectively, do you accept the doctrines of Mr. Montgomery? Dr. Montgomery. So we have Montgomery and Maginnis opposed to each other, and both of them, in a way, what Montgomery was doing was trying to hold back the tide. And we may question whether or not we consider his actions were entirely wise at this time, because non-subscribers, of course, have the right of personal judgment to come to their own conclusions, and that was the line that Maginnis took. And Maginnis even quoted Montgomery back at himself in the course of these debates. The new code was only for the Remonstrant Synod. There were attempts at one point to bring in the Synod of Munster and the Presbytery of Antrim to see if they would combine in this, but John Scott Porter in particular was actually quite opposed to the idea of trying to codify things at this time, and so that was unsuccessful. And it's important to note that we have these 3 different strands in Presbyterianism, in non-subscribing Presbyterianism at the time, and we have the new code only applying to the Remonstrant Synod, because that has a big impact on what happened next.